All right, let's jump into something really fascinating today. We're talking about, a foundational piece of legal history, really, the Code of Hammurabi.
Hmm.
This ancient Babylonian text, it dates back, like way back, around 1750 BC, give or take a few years.
Yeah.
What's remarkable is it's the longest, uh, most organized, and best preserved legal document that we have.
Right. From that whole area, that whole time period.
Exactly, the ancient Near East, really.
And the main copy, the one everyone's always looking at, it's on a steel.
A steel.
Yeah, basalt. It's pretty impressive. Stand like over 2 meters tall, a little over 7 feet.
Right, it's in the Louvre, right?
Louvre Museum. Yep, that's where it ended up. But it has a bit of a history, a journey. It wasn't always there.
Oh, I bet. Plunder, maybe.
You got it. It was originally found in Susa, that's modern-day Iran. Someone hauled it off as loot, probably around 600 years after it was made.
600 years, that's a long time to be
Yeah.
a trophy, I guess.
Yeah, but it wasn't just sitting around gathering dust. Mesopotamian scribes, they kept copying it, studying it for, get this, over 1,000 years.
1,000 years. So, like, they really saw something important in it.
Absolutely.
So, all right, we've got this huge stone slab. What's on it? Besides, ancient graffiti.
Uh-huh. Well, at the top, there's a relief, a carving. It shows Hammurabi, the king, with Shamash. He was the Babylonian sun god.
Right, and he was also, like, the god of justice.
Right, exactly. So, Hammurabi's not messing around, divine backing and all that.
Makes sense. Law and order, straight from the top, literally.
Then below that image, you've got lines and lines of cuneiform.
That's the wedge-shaped writing for anyone who needs a refresher.
Yeah, about 4,130 lines of it.
That's a lot of writing.
It is. It's divided into sections. There's a prologue and an epilogue. Kind of bookends. They're poetic. A little over a fifth of the whole thing. And then, of course, the laws, the main course. That's about 4/5 of the text.
Ah, so the prologue and epilogue are setting the stage, like framing the laws.
Exactly. And in ancient Near Eastern texts like this, they often served a few purposes. They'd establish the ruler's legitimacy, maybe by tracing their lineage or highlighting their achievements.
Oh, sure. Got to show off the royal resume a bit.
Right. And they'd also sort of summarize the purpose of the document, set the tone, give it some context.
It's like an introduction to conclusion all rolled into one.
Yeah, exactly.
So what does Hammurabi say in this prologue, this intro to his legal masterpiece?
Well, there's a line that's particularly interesting, I think. It's where Hammurabi says, "The gods gave him his power to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak."
That's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, think about it. He's basically saying the whole point of this legal system, at least according to him, is to protect the vulnerable.
That's an idea that's still with us today. I mean, it's a core principle of, justice.
Absolutely. And this statement in the prologue, it's not just a throwaway line. It sets the tone for the entire code. It gives us a window into what Hammurabi, or at least the scribes writing for him, intended this legal framework to do.
So it's more than just a list of rules. It's a statement about how society should work, how power should be used.
Right, exactly.
All right, so our goal today is to really dig into this ancient text, the Code of Hammurabi.
Yeah.
To understand it, to see what it can tell us about the people who created it, about their world, their values.
Definitely. And a good place to start, I think, is with the structure of the laws themselves, how they're written, how they're organized.
Okay, so structure. What are we looking at here?
Well, most of the laws are what we call casuistic. It's a fancy word, but it basically means they follow an if-then pattern. If this happens, then this is the consequence. Very specific, very concrete.
So it's not just, general principles. It's like case-by-case scenarios.
Precisely.
All right, so give us an example, for instance.
Okay, so one of the most famous principles in the code is lex talionis.
Ah, an eye for an eye.
Exactly. And we see this in laws like if an Oweelam...
That's a free man, right?
Yes, a free man. If an Oweelam should blind the eye of another Oweelam, they shall blind his eye.
Pretty straightforward.
Right, very direct. You do harm, you receive the same harm in return. It emphasizes reciprocity and justice. You get what you give.
Makes sense, in a way.
Yeah.
But it wasn't always so literal, was it? Like a direct eye for an eye.
Good point. It wasn't always so simple. There were situations where the punishment wasn't a mirror image of the crime. For example, think about the laws about house collapses.
Wait, house is collapsing. Sounds bad.
Right. Very bad. So if a house collapsed and the homeowner died, the builder, they could be put to death.
Oh, wow. High stakes for shoddy construction.
Absolutely. But there's another law, Law 230. It says that if the homeowner's son died, then the builder's son would be put to death.
Hold on, so the punishment gets transferred to the next generation? That's a bit different from, the builder themselves facing the consequences.
Right. It shows a different way of thinking about responsibility and maybe about families. It's like they were seen as a unit, so the consequences could extend beyond the individual.
It's like a collective punishment, almost.
You could say that.
So we've got an eye for an eye, we've got this transfer of punishment. What else do we need to know about how justice worked in ancient Babylon?
Well, we can't talk about justice without talking about social hierarchy.
Right, because it wasn't like everyone was equal under the law, were they?
Not at all. The code explicitly mentions different social classes. You've got the Awilim, the freeman, then there's the Mushonim, they were commoners, and then at the bottom you have the Wardum, the male slave, and the Amtum, the female slave.
And these different classes, they didn't get treated the same in court, did they?
No, not at all. The punishments, the fines, everything could vary depending on your social standing.
So if a rich guy and a poor guy committed the same crime,
The rich guy might get off with a smaller fine, while the poor guy could face, corporal punishment or even death.
so justice had a price tag, basically.
In a way, yeah. But it's not quite as simple as just saying the higher classes always had it easier.
Oh, how so?
Well, for example, sometimes the life of a Mushonim was considered to have a lower monetary value. Like, if you accidentally killed one, the compensation would be less than if you killed an Awilim.
That's pretty messed up.
Yeah, it is. But on the flip side, sometimes their fines were also lower. It's a complex system, and even within the Awilim class, there were distinctions.
Like what?
There's a couple of laws 200 and 202, that suggest there were different ranks within the Owilim class. So even among the free men, there were levels of privilege.
It's like a whole web of social status and legal consequences.
Exactly, a complicated web.
Okay, so we've got social hierarchy baked into the system. What else stands out? Anything that maybe we'd recognize today as like a fair legal principle?
Well, yeah, actually. There are some underlying principles in the code that might surprise us.
Oh, like what?
Well, right off the bat, the first two laws, they deal with false accusations of homicide.
False accusations.
Yeah, and they're pretty strict. If you accuse someone of murder but you can't prove it, you get punished.
So they had something like a presumption of innocence.
It seems that way. You had to have evidence to back up your claims. And speaking of evidence, they placed a high value on written evidence, especially for things like contracts. And there's this idea of one crime, one punishment. You get punished for what you did, not for who you are or who your family is, at least in theory.
Right, we talked about those exceptions earlier.
Yeah, but the principle is there. And there's even some recognition of intent, whether someone did something on purpose or by accident.
So it's not just about blindly applying the law. There's some nuance there.
Yeah, there's definitely some thinking going on about what's fair.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, the principles. Can we get into some specifics, like actual examples of what these laws covered?
Absolutely. Let's take a little tour through different categories of law.
Right, lead the way.
Well, starting with offenses against the administration of law, we've got that Law 1, the one about false accusations. You can't just go around accusing people of murder without evidence.
Makes sense. What about property?
Property offenses. Oh, they took those very seriously. Law 21, for example, deals with breaking and entering. The penalty. Death.
Whoa.
Yeah, and not just death. You'd be hung at the breach in the wall as a warning to others.
Grim.
Very grim. But then you've got laws about land and houses that show a different side.
Okay, like what?
Well, take Law 48. It's a form of debt relief for farmers.
Debt relief.
Yeah, if a farmer had a bad harvest because of natural disasters, a flood or a drought, or if the irrigation canals weren't delivering enough water, they wouldn't have to pay back their debts that year.
Oh, that's actually pretty
Yeah.
compassionate.
Right. It shows an understanding that sometimes things are just outside of your control.
So it's not all just harsh punishments. There's some fairness built into.
Definitely. And then there's a whole section on commerce.
Commerce. Okay, so like business deals?
Yeah, things like contracts, trade, loans, that sort of thing. One that's interesting is Law 102. It's about trading agents.
Trading agents.
Yeah, so imagine a merchant gives an agent some silver to invest on a trip, a business venture. If the agent loses the money, maybe because of bandits or a bad deal, they only have to pay back the original sum.
So the agent isn't on the hook for the lost profits.
Right. It's a way of sharing the risk, recognizing that things can happen when you're doing business.
Smart. Okay, what about family stuff? Marriage, kids, inheritance,
Oh, there's a whole section on that. One that stands out is Law 185. It deals with adoption.
adoption.
Yeah, if a man takes in a child at birth and raises them, that child can't be reclaimed later by the biological parents.
Interesting. So it's about the bond you create, not just, blood ties.
Exactly. It recognizes the importance of upbringing and the ties that form through caregiving.
So family law, business law, we've talked about property. What else?
Well, we can't forget about the eye for an eye stuff.
Right, assault, injury, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Law 196 is the classic example. It might sound harsh to us today, but back then it was actually a way to limit retaliation, to establish some kind of proportion in punishment.
So instead of an endless cycle of revenge,
You had a system, a way to stop things from escalating. It's an attempt to create order to control violence.
interesting. Okay, so assault.
Oh.
What about professional negligence? Like if a doctor messed up,
Oh, they had laws about that too. Law 233 deals with builders. If
Yeah.
they built a house that wasn't up to code and a wall collapsed, they had to fix it at their own expense.
accountability. Good to see.
Yeah.
Any laws about animals? Like if your dog bit someone or your camel trampled their crops?
Uh-huh. Well, there's Law 250. It covers the situation where an ox gores a man to death in the street.
An ox in the street.
Yeah. Yeah, apparently that was a concern. But what's interesting is that the law says in that specific scenario, there's no basis for claims.
No claims. So like tough luck.
Seems that way. Maybe it was just considered an inherent risk of having oxen around.
All right, fair enough. Anything about contracts for services?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Law 277 is about boat rentals.
Boat rentals, specific.
Well, they were big on trade, remember? So boats were important. The law sets the rental fee based on the size of the boat.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the elephant in the room?
Slavery.
Yeah, slavery. Were there laws about that?
Absolutely. And they're pretty stark. Law 281, for instance, says that if a slave denies their master and it's proven they are indeed that person's slave, they get their ear cut off.
That's brutal.
It is. It shows how dehumanized slaves were, how little legal protection they had.
It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in some ways.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gotten a good sense of the content of these laws. We've seen the punishments, the social hierarchy, the different areas of life they covered. But I think there's a big question that's still hanging out there.
What's that?
The purpose. Like, what was the point of this code? Was it really just a set of rules to be enforced, like the law of the land?
And it's one that scholars have been debating for centuries, ever since the code was rediscovered. The traditional view, the one that emerged early on, was that it was a legislative code meant to be enforced, just like, Justinian's code or the Napoleonic Code.
Makes sense. It's called a code, right?
Right. And there's even this term that's found in one copy of the code, imdat shunum. It means royal decree.
Okay, so that seems to support the idea that it was like official law.
Yeah, but over time, some pretty compelling arguments against this legislation theory have emerged.
Oh, so what are they saying? Why wouldn't it be a law code?
Well, for one thing, there are a lot of things that are just missing. If this was meant to govern every aspect of life, there are some pretty big gaps.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they talk a lot about agriculture, about fields and crops and cattle, but there's almost nothing about shepherds. And shepherds were crucial to the Babylonian economy. They raised sheep for wool, for meat, for milk.
So you're saying it's weird that they'd leave out such an important part of their society.
Exactly. And then there are the laws that just seem, implausible. Like there's one about threshing with goats.
Threshing.
Yeah, separating the grain from the chaff. And they're talking about using goats to do it.
Goats. That seems a bit impractical.
Right. Goats are not exactly known for their threshing abilities. So some scholars say, why would they include laws about things that no one would actually do? It doesn't make sense if this was meant to be a practical legal guide.
Okay, so missing pieces, implausible scenarios. What else?
Well, there's the format. It's strictly casuistic, remember. If, then. There are no general commands, no broad principles laid out.
So it's all about specific cases, not overall rules.
Exactly. And that's different from how a lot of later law codes were written.
Interesting. Anything else that makes people doubt the law code theory?
The biggest thing, the really big thing, is that there's almost no evidence that the code was actually used in court.
Wait, what? So we have all these legal documents from ancient Babylon, and they never mention the Code of Hammurabi.
Rarely, if ever. It's strange, right? If it was the law of the land, you'd expect to see judges citing it, referring to it in their decisions, but they don't.
That's a pretty big hole in the law code theory.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so if it wasn't a law code, what was it? What are the other options?
Well, one idea is that it was a kind of law report.
A law report, like a summary of past legal cases.
Yeah, something like that. The idea is that the code is a collection of real cases, real judgments, just phrased in a more general, abstract way.
So instead of saying, Bob did this to Joe, and the judge decided this, it says if someone does this, then this is the consequence.
Right. And the casuistic format would fit with that. It's how legal precedents are often presented.
Okay, that makes sense. But is there any evidence to support this theory?
Well, the problem is that while we have tons of legal documents from ancient Mesopotamia, it's hard to find direct links between them and specific laws in the code. And the way those judgments were written, they tend to focus on the facts of the case, the details. The code is more about general principles.
So it's not a perfect fit.
No, it's not.
Okay, so we've got the law code theory, which has some problems. We've got the law report theory, which also has some problems. What's the third option?
The third option, and the one that's gaining a lot of traction these days, is what's called the jurisprudence theory.
Jurisprudence.
Yeah.
Sounds fancy.
It basically means legal theory, legal thinking. The idea here is that the code wasn't meant to be a practical guide for judges, but rather like a theoretical exploration of law.
So it's more about ideas than actual law.
Yeah, more like a textbook or a treatise on legal principles.
Okay, so how does this theory explain all the weird stuff we talked about before? The missing laws, the goats.
Well, if it's not meant to be a practical guide, then those things don't matter as much. It's about exploring different legal scenarios, different principles, not about laying down the law for every situation.
So it's like a thought experiment, almost.
Kinda, yeah.
All right, but how does the format fit into this? The if, then, the lists.
That's where it gets really interesting. The code actually shares a lot of similarities with other Mesopotamian scholarly texts. Things like omen collections, king lists, god lists. They all tend to follow a list format, with entries arranged according to certain principles.
Okay, so you're saying the code is organized like a scholarly text, not a law book.
Exactly. And there are two main principles they used: opposition and pointillism.
All right, break those down for me.
Sure. Opposition is when you take one law and then you change one variable to create a new law. It's about highlighting the contrast, showing how a slight change can lead to a different outcome.
Give me an example.
Okay, so laws 215 and 218, they're both about surgeons. One is about their fee if they perform a successful surgery. The other is about the punishment if they cause harm during surgery. Same procedure, different outcome, different legal consequences.
Got it. So opposition is about contrasts, different sides of the same coin. What about pointillism?
Pointillism is about adding details, building up a series of related laws. It's like starting with a basic scenario and then adding layers of complexity.
Okay, example.
All right, look at laws 27 through 29. They deal with soldiers who are taken captive.
Oh, wow, that's rough.
Yeah. So the first law is about a soldier who comes back home. The next law adds a detail. What if the soldier has a son who can take his place in the army? Then the third law adds another detail. What if the son is too young to serve? See how it's building up a picture, exploring different facets of the situation.
Yeah, I see. So pointillism is about layering, exploring the nuances.
Exactly. And this helps explain those odd laws, like the one about threshing with goats.
Oh, right, the goats are back.
They never really left. Ha ha. So the idea is that there was probably an established series of animals used for threshing, and the goat was included just to complete the set, even if no one actually used goats for that. It's about scholarly completeness, not practicality.
So it's like they're creating a theoretical system, exploring all the possibilities, even if some of them are a bit far-fetched.
Precisely.
Okay, so this jurisprudence theory, it's about legal thinking, about creating a framework, not about enforcing rules. But why would they do that? What was the point?
Well, remember how we talked about scribes copying the code for over 1,000 years? It seems like it was a key text in their education. They were learning how to think about law, how to reason about justice. It was about shaping their minds, not controlling their actions.
So it's like a foundational text, a way of transmitting legal knowledge and values.
Right. It's even listed in a late Babylonian list of literary and scholarly texts. No other law collection achieved that kind of status. They saw it as a work of scholarship, not just a set of rules.
Fascinating. So maybe instead of thinking of it as a code, we should think of it as like a treatise on law, a guide for legal thinking.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about what the code might have been for the Babylonians, but what about its impact on later legal systems? How does it fit into the bigger picture of legal history?
That's a great question, and it's one that sparked a lot of debate. So first, let's look back. Hammurabi's code, it wasn't the first set of laws in Mesopotamia. There were earlier collections, like the codes of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar.
And how does Hammurabi's code compare to those earlier ones?
Well, there are some striking similarities, like they often have prologues and epilogues, just like Hammurabi's, and they also make claims of divine legitimacy for the ruler.
Right, gotta have the gods on your side.
Exactly. And the principle of one crime, one punishment, that's there too. And when you look at the specific laws, the types of cases they cover, the language they use, there are clear parallels.
So it seems like Hammurabi was building on a tradition, right? He wasn't just coming up with this stuff out of nowhere.
Right. And we know that scribes were still copying those older law collections during Hammurabi's time, so they were definitely aware of them. They were drawing on that existing legal knowledge.
Okay, so connections to the past. What about connections to the future? Like, did the Code of Hammurabi influence later legal systems?
That's where it gets a bit trickier. One of the big questions is its relationship with the Mosaic Law, the laws in the Hebrew Bible.
Right, because there's some pretty obvious similarities, aren't there? Like an eye for an eye, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the casuistic format, the if-then structure, that's a common element too. And there are even some specific laws that are very similar, like the laws about a man-goring ox.
So did the Hebrews just copy from the Babylonians?
That's what some people thought initially, but most scholars today, they think it's more complicated than that.
Okay, so what's the current thinking?
Well, they say that while there was definitely cultural contact between Mesopotamia and the Levant, the area where the ancient Israelites lived, the similarities are probably due to a shared heritage, a common set of legal and social traditions in the ancient Near East.
So, like, they both drew from the same well, but they didn't necessarily copy directly from each other.
Right. Think of it like two branches growing from the same tree. They might look similar, but they've also developed in their own ways.
Okay, that makes sense. What about influence on other legal systems, like the Greeks, the Romans?
That's less clear. Some scholars see possible connections, but it's hard to prove. You know, tracing influence across centuries is always a challenge.
Right, it's like a game of telephone. The message can get distorted over time. So even if there was some influence, it's probably mixed in with a lot of other things.
Exactly.
All right, so maybe its direct impact on later legal systems is debatable, but it's clearly a significant document in its own right.
Absolutely. It tells us so much about Babylonian society, about their values, their ideas about justice, their way of life.
And it continues to fascinate people today. I mean, it's not every day that an ancient legal text ends up in the U.S. Capitol.
Haha, right. There's actually a relief portrait of Hammurabi in the House chamber, alongside other figures who are seen as important to the history of law.
So he's in good company.
He is.
Yeah.
And there are replicas of the stele at the UN headquarters in New York and at the Peace Palace in The Hague.
Wow, so it's become a symbol of, like, the enduring quest for justice, for law and order.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, so we've talked about law, about history, about influence. But there's another aspect of the code that I find really interesting.
What's that?
The medical stuff. The fact that it deals with things like surgery, medical fees, malpractice.
Oh, yeah. The medico-legal aspects are really fascinating. There are specific rules about how doctors should be trained, what they can charge for different procedures, and what happens if they make a mistake.
Like what kind of mistakes?
Well, for example, if a surgeon caused the death of a noble during surgery, they could be severely punished. They might even have their hand cut off.
Wow. Talk about accountability.
Right? It shows how seriously they took medical responsibility.
And it's interesting how those two fields, medicine and law, were so intertwined even back then.
Yeah, definitely. They recognized that medical practice had legal implications, that there needed to be rules and consequences.
It's like the beginning of medical ethics, in a way.
You could say that.
Okay, so last but not least, I want to touch on something we've been dancing around this whole time.
What's that?
Social hierarchy. The code is full of it, right? Different punishments for different classes, different levels of protection under the law.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from the code. It's not just a legal document, it's a political document. It reflects the power dynamics of Babylonian society, the way that the elites use law to maintain their position, to control those below them.
So it's a reminder that Law is never neutral, right? It always serves someone's interests.
Right. And understanding who benefits from a legal system, who gets protected, who gets punished, that's crucial to understanding how power works.
Absolutely.
It's something we should always be thinking about, even today, when we look at our own legal systems.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at the laws themselves, the different theories about their purpose, the code's historical context, its influence, its legacy. It's a huge topic.
It really is, and we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Exactly.